You're the strong one. You always have been. The emotional first responder. The reliable fixer. The I'll drop everything to help type. You hand out advice like free samples, suppress your own breakdowns to hold space for someone else's, and secretly fantasize about being the kind of person who ignores texts for days without guilt. And now you're tired. Not just tired, soul tired. That kind of exhaustion that coffee, vacations, and positive thinking can't touch. Because it's not your body that's worn out, it's your boundaries. Or rather, the lack of them. Carl Jung once said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." But you've been trying to wear a shoe 5 sizes too small, constantly adjusting your shape to suit other people's comfort. And it hurts. You're not crazy for feeling like you're unraveling. You've built a whole identity around being useful, needed, accommodating. That wasn't selflessness. That was survival. It started early, didn't it? Maybe it was the parent who only noticed you when you were helpful. The teacher who praised your perfectionism. The partner who adored your strength until you needed support. You got addicted to being needed because being needy was never safe. And now, you've become everyone's emergency contact, but no one's priority. You say yes because you're afraid that saying no will make you look selfish. You're always fine because being honest might burden someone else. You give without limit, but when it's your turn to need something, crickets. Here's the thing nobody tells you about chronic people-pleasing. It's a trauma response dressed up as a virtue. You became the strong one because vulnerability wasn't allowed. Because being too much was punished. Because the only way to feel safe was to be indispensable. Historians still argue whether Jung viewed this kind of compulsive helpfulness as a byproduct of the ego or the shadow, but either way, it's clear, the urge to save others often masks a deep fear of not being enough on your own. And now, you're starting to question everything. You help someone again, and this time, it doesn't feel noble. It feels hollow. You hear your own voice giving advice and realize it's a script. You cancel your own plans to be there for someone, and suddenly you're the one needing rescue. And the worst part, you still feel guilty for even thinking of pulling back. Like you're betraying some sacred moral code by resting. But you're not betraying anyone. You're just starting to notice that being emotionally available 24/7 is not kindness, it's codependence with good manners. Here's your darkly humorous self-reflection moment. You've been running an unpaid emotional support hotline for years, except the phones never stop ringing, there's no health insurance, and your only reward is occasional crumbs of gratitude and chronic neck pain. Let that sink in. Because the truth is, emotional availability isn't infinite. And being kind doesn't mean being a martyr. Jung would tell you that wholeness doesn't come from suppressing your own needs for others. It comes from embracing the uncomfortable truth that you are not responsible for everyone else's healing. Say it out loud, I am not the solution to their storm. You can love someone and still let them sit in their discomfort. You can show up less and still matter. You can say no and still be good. Imagine this, you're at a party. Someone drops a drink. You, of course, grab napkins, apologize even though it wasn't your fault, and offer to clean it up. Meanwhile, the person who dropped it shrugs and walks away. That's your whole life in a metaphor. Here's a radical thought, what happens if you just let the mess stay? Because every time you rescue someone from their own consequences, you rob them of the chance to grow. And you rob yourself of energy that was never yours to give away. You want to reconnect with yourself? Then start by doing nothing. Not forever, just long enough to hear what your own needs sound like without someone else's voice drowning them out. You don't need a crisis to justify resting. You don't need permission to stop being everything to everyone. Your worth is not in your usefulness. Your strength is not in your silence. Your power is not in your perfection. And one day, when someone says, but you've always been the strong one, you'll smile and respond, yeah. And now I'm strong enough to stop. You finally did it. You walked away. Or maybe you just stopped replying. You ghosted the group chat. You skipped the phone call. You let the email go unread. You said no without cushioning it with a 14-slide PowerPoint about your mental health. And now, cue the guilt. It doesn't matter how justified your boundary was. Your brain, ever the guilt-ridden overachiever, has filed it under potential betrayal in your mental archive, alongside such hits as that one time you didn't text back immediately and at the time you canceled plans for your own sanity. Because setting boundaries isn't just hard. It's grief-inducing. You didn't just leave a person. You left a version of yourself behind, the one who always showed up, no matter what it cost you. And now you're haunted by the silence. Wondering, did I overreact? Was it selfish? Should I have explained more? Carl Jung once wrote, loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And in this case, what's important is hard to explain. You didn't leave out of anger. You left out of self-preservation. And that's a story that rarely gets sympathy. But it's real. And here's the kicker, the guilt you feel. It's not proof that you were wrong. It's proof that you've been trained to abandon yourself for others so often, any deviation feels like a crime. Historians still argue whether Jung viewed guilt as a necessary moral compass or a socially conditioned weapon, but in your case, it feels like both. You're grieving, not just the person or situation, but the identity you had within it. The role you played, the emotional paycheck you got from being good, available, understanding. But now that role doesn't fit anymore. And instead of a gold watch and a cake for all your years of service, you got passive-aggressive texts, confusion, and the echo of your own second-guessing. That's where the pain lives. Not in the decision, but in the space after it. The emotional hangover, the doubt spiral. So let's pause here and call it out for what it is, grief disguised as guilt. You mourn the version of yourself who could tolerate it, the version who didn't know better, the one who still hoped it would change. And now, knowing what you know, you can't go back. That's grief. And the guilt. That's your trauma's way of trying to get you to make it right by returning to the dynamic that broke you. But you can't heal while proving to others that your pain was polite enough to deserve validation. Here's your self-reflective dark humor for today. Setting boundaries is like quitting a job where you weren't getting paid, but somehow still feel bad for not giving 2 weeks' notice. Let that hit. You were working overtime in an emotional role that wasn't even yours. And now that you've quit, you're worried about being unprofessional in your healing. No. You don't owe anyone an eloquent speech when your nervous system is screaming, "Get out." You don't need a permission slip to protect your peace. So what do you do with the guilt? First, name it. Say, "This is grief." Say, "This is what healing costs." Say, "I am allowed to mourn the old story while writing a better one." Second, ground yourself in reality. Write down the reasons you left. List the ways you betrayed yourself to stay. Not to shame yourself, but to remind your heart that this was a conscious evolution, not a reaction. Third, practice new language. Instead of "I feel bad," say "I feel free and scared at the same time." Instead of "I shouldn't have done that," try "I did what I had to do with the tools I had at the time." Language matters, because what you call it is what you believe about it. And finally, stop asking people for permission to heal in ways they don't understand. You're not going to get a standing ovation for walking away from toxicity. You might get silence. You might get judgment. You might get ghosted right back. That doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you were early to your own peace, early to your own clarity, early to a version of life where you are no longer the emotional crutch holding up everyone else's limp narrative. Yes, it might feel like you lost something, but what you gained? Self-respect, space, sanity, sleep. And let's be honest, when's the last time you truly slept without someone else's crisis echoing in your brain? You did the hard thing. You stepped out of the role and into the unknown. And that uncertainty, it's not danger, it's freedom. The kind of freedom that feels empty at first, like a house without furniture, but that's only because you finally have a home to decorate for you. No more apologizing for locking the door. No more guilt for not explaining the lock. No more shame for the fact that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away and stay gone. You didn't mean to go numb. You just needed some space. You needed quiet after years of noise. You needed a little peace that didn't cost your self-respect. But somewhere along the way, detachment turned into disappearance. Solitude turned into isolation. And now you're wondering, have I gone too far? You're not alone in this question. In fact, it's one of the most whispered confessions in healing spaces. I used to be a people pleaser. Now I don't even want to answer the door. Carl Jung once observed, a man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. But let's be honest, you passed through the inferno and then built a cabin in it. You stopped letting people in not because you're healed, but because you're still smoldering, still half afraid, still suspicious that connection equals danger. And that's okay for a time, because yes, detachment can be a form of self-love. It can be a reboot, a recalibration, a nervous system finally given the chance to breathe without needing to read the emotional weather report of everyone in a 30-foot radius. But here's the tricky part, detachment, when left unchecked, can become avoidance in drag. You stop trusting others because you're still learning how to trust yourself. You say, "I'm just protecting my peace," while ghosting people who genuinely cared. You avoid vulnerability not because you don't crave it, but because you still associate openness with betrayal. Historians still argue whether Jung considered individuation to be achievable in complete solitude or only through relational friction. But what's clear is this: we don't find ourselves by ourselves. We find ourselves in contrast, in mirror, in mess. You know this, but knowing and doing are different beasts. Especially when doing means risking, and risk sounds exhausting after everything you've been through. So here's your reflection point. Are you detached, or are you hiding? Are you setting healthy boundaries, or are you putting up walls with snipers on the roof? Are you unavailable, or are you just terrified to be seen? This is where it gets real. Because at some point, healing means coming back down the mountain. It means allowing some people back in, and not all, not recklessly, but intentionally. The goal was never to become untouched by life. It was to become unshakable within it. So how do you know the difference between sacred detachment and subtle self-abandonment? Try this. Pay attention to how you feel after interactions. When you say no to something, do you feel aligned or relieved in a way that smells like fear? When someone checks in and you ignore it, does your silence feel empowered, or does it throb with loneliness? When you think about being seen in your full complexity, your joy, your shame, your unpolished truth, do you feel safe, or do you want to run? Here's your dark humor gut check. If your healing journey includes a phase where you fantasize about becoming a forest hermit with no Wi-Fi, no social obligations, and a pet raccoon named Detachment, congratulations, you're doing great. Just don't marry the raccoon, okay? Because the deeper truth is this: isolation feels easier than connection until it starts to rot. You don't notice it at first. The silence is comforting. The space is liberating. But then days blur. Weeks feel heavy. Your voice gets quieter, not just externally, but internally. And when someone does reach out, you feel resentment and longing at the same time. That's your soul knocking. Not to demand you throw open the doors, but to ask, can we let one safe thing back in? One person, one risk, one brave moment of being seen, even if we tremble doing it. Because the goal of all this work, the boundaries, the detachment, the inner child shadowboxing, isn't to build a fortress. It's to build a bridge, one strong enough to walk across when you're ready. So here's your practice. Pick one moment this week where you choose engagement over avoidance. Not people-pleasing, not overextending, just showing up. Reply to the message you've been ignoring. Ask a real question instead of faking small talk. Let someone see your confusion, your contradiction, your humanness. And when that panic voice inside says, this is dangerous, whisper back, it's also healing. Because detachment should feel like breathing, not like holding your breath indefinitely. You are allowed to want peace and connection. You are allowed to retreat and return. You are allowed to be discerning without disappearing. And one day soon, you'll find that sweet spot where your solitude strengthens you and your openness doesn't end in self-sacrifice. That's not weakness. That's wholeness. There's a moment that doesn't get posted on Healing TikTok. It doesn't come with soft music or sunbeams through linen curtains. It doesn't smell like sage or lavender. It's the moment you realize, with painful clarity, that someone you trusted wasn't confused or doing their best or unaware of how much it hurt you. They knew. They just didn't care enough to stop. Carl Jung once wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But some people, let's be honest, are quite conscious. They've studied your buttons like a piano student before recital. And when you finally realize it wasn't just a misunderstanding but manipulation, is something inside you snaps or wakes up. That's the moment of the awakening, and it usually comes with nausea, shaky hands, and a 3-day deep dive into narcissistic abuse videos. You feel like you've been emotionally mugged in a dark alley where the street lamp was your own self-doubt. You start replaying everything, every harmless comment, every time they said, you're too sensitive, when your intuition was screaming, every apology you made just to keep the pace, every emotional ping-pong match you lost while trying to stay compassionate. And now, you're angry. And that's good. Historians still argue whether Jung saw anger as a gateway emotion or a shadow manifestation, but in your case, it's both. It's the righteous fury of realizing your nervous system wasn't overreacting. It was responding perfectly to a situation designed to keep you small. Here's your self-reflection gut punch. Manipulators don't need to destroy you. They just need you to doubt yourself long enough that you never leave. And the terrifying thing is, it worked. You stayed. You rationalized. You clung to the fantasy of potential. You confused control for closeness, silence for safety, guilt for love. But now, you see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's where it gets messy. Because even though you're waking up, your trauma's muscle memory wants to pull you back in. It wants to react. Send a long message. Explain yourself into oblivion. Prove your worth one last time. Just one more round of emotional hopscotch. But here's your dark humor moment. Getting reactive with a manipulator is like trying to win a chess match where the other person keeps stealing pieces off the board and gaslighting you about the rules. You don't win that game by playing harder. You win by walking away from the table. So how do you break the loop? First, notice the hook. That moment you feel the urge to explain yourself, fix things, or seek validation. That's the bait. Breathe. Pause. Remember, the goal is not to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Second, anchor to reality. Write down what happened, what was said, what you felt. Because manipulative dynamics live in fog, documentation becomes your flashlight. Clarity is your weapon. Third, create a trauma ritual. Seriously, When you feel pulled into old patterns, do something physical to remind your body that it's safe now. Touch your chest. Say your name. Light a candle and whisper, "I'm no longer available for this story." Whatever grounds you, do it. Because you're not just healing from them, you're healing from the version of you who normalized that pain, who believed that love had to hurt, who kept choosing peace over truth. And here's the real heartbreak: sometimes you still miss them. Of course you do. Not because they were safe, but because the chaos became familiar. And our brains are wired to seek the familiar, even if it's toxic. But you're not that version anymore. You're not begging for scraps with a smile. You're not twisting yourself into emotional origami just to avoid being called too much. You're not keeping the peace by detonating your own boundaries. You're awake now. And that means you get to choose. You get to choose how you respond, who you respond to. Whether a phone call at 11 p.m. is a crisis or just another test. Whether silence is punishment or liberation. Whether their confusion is your job to clarify or a mask they wear to keep control. You get to stop explaining yourself. You get to stop playing small. You get to stop sacrificing yourself on the altar of just one more chance. Because survival taught you to react. Healing teaches you to pause. And in that pause, that's where freedom lives. You made it through the fog. And now comes the most disorienting part of all: nothing is burning. There's no emotional fire to put out, no manipulator poking your boundaries like a loose tooth, no guilt storm dragging you back to the role you outgrew. Just silence. And for the first time, you have to ask, now what? You spent so long surviving, so long deciphering subtext, reading emotional weather reports, over-explaining, apologizing, repairing, that stillness feels suspicious. Like maybe something's wrong. Like maybe healing is a trap. It's not. It's just new. Carl Jung would tell you this is individuation's quiet middle, not the fiery beginning where you break free, and not the triumphant ending where you feel like a fully evolved soul sipping mushroom tea in a sunbeam, but that messy, in-between place where you're still shedding, still shaping, still figuring out what the hell to do now that you're not running on chaos. He once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But no one talks about how awkward that is. Because when you're no longer defined by pain, people-pleasing, or performance, who even are you? You are someone learning that your pain wasn't a punishment. It was a map. One that led you here to this moment where you have enough space to actually choose. So let's get practical. You want to become immune to emotional pain. You want to stop orbiting around other people's moods, manipulations, and projections. You need rituals, anchors, practices that remind your body and brain that you are safe, sovereign, and no longer required to self-abandon just to be loved. Try these. 1. The "not mine" mantra. Whenever you feel overwhelmed by someone else's emotion, story, or judgment, pause and whisper, "Not mine." It's small, it's quiet, but it severs energetic leashes faster than a breakup text from someone who uses namaste passive-aggressively. 2. Permission slips. Write this on paper and put it somewhere you'll see it every day. I am allowed to disappoint people who expected me to abandon myself. Because that's the root wound, isn't it? The guilt of saying no. The fear of being seen as cruel for choosing yourself. But the truth is, people who benefited from your silence will always call your clarity a betrayal. 3. Anchor days. Pick one day a week, just one, where you do nothing for anyone else. No favors. No emotional labor. No checking in out of obligation. Use that day to listen to your own voice. The first time, you'll feel selfish. The second time, you'll feel lighter. The third time, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it. 4. Shadow work for real life. Shadow work isn't just journaling under a full moon. It's noticing the part of you that wants revenge, validation, applause, and instead of shaming it, getting curious. Ask, where did this part first show up? What was it trying to protect me from? What does it need now to feel seen without taking over? That's integration. That's emotional immunity, not numbness, but awareness with choice. Historians still argue whether Jung saw wholeness as an achievable state or an ongoing process, but you already know the truth, it's both. Because some days you'll feel peaceful and powerful, sipping tea like the spiritual adult you've become. Other days, you'll regress, spiral, people please, and cry on the floor next to a sock you're too tired to pick up. That's still healing. That's still holy. And through it all, you are no longer sleepwalking. You are awake now. You feel things without being controlled by them. You show up without shape-shifting. You say no without a novel-length explanation. You walk away without building a courtroom defense in your head. That's not cold. That's not selfish. That's not too much. That's someone who's finally done calling pain a love. So if you're wondering whether you've healed enough to stop hurting, try this instead. Ask yourself whether you're willing to keep showing up real, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it disappoints people, even when it costs you approval. Because healing doesn't mean you'll never get triggered again. It means the trigger no longer drives the car. You do. So you did it. You went all the way in, through the burnout, through the guilt, through the silence of detachment, the sting of awakening, and the disorientation of freedom. You made it here, this strange, sacred, slightly awkward space where your nervous system isn't on fire and your self-worth doesn't hinge on how useful or likable you are. You're not invincible. You're just done handing out your emotional organs like Halloween candy to anyone who looks vaguely disappointed in you. And that's immunity. Not because you don't feel anymore, but because you feel intentionally, with discernment, with boundaries, with the awareness that your peace is no longer up for negotiation. Carl Jung wouldn't tell you to be fearless. He'd tell you to be whole. He'd remind you that the parts of you you've tried to exile, your anger, your cynicism, your exhaustion, were never the enemy. They were your allies. The sacred symptoms of a self waking up from a coma of compliance. You don't owe your healing to anyone. You don't need a spiritual certificate or a trauma resume to qualify for peace. All you need is this: to pause before you react, to listen before you rescue, to choose yourself even when it costs you the illusion of being good, because good nearly killed you. So be real instead. Be aware. Be present. Be someone who looks their pain in the eye and says, I learned from you. But you don't drive anymore. And when someone tells you you've changed, smile and say, yes, finally.